"Good morning, Special Investigator Harmon," said Maria Reyes as she entered Harmon's small office, which he shared with another investigator. Seeing the look on his face, she changed her greeting to, "Hello, Mike." He had been working for her as an investigator for 6 months. "Hello, Prosecutor Reyes," Mike replied, smiling at his boss, and added, "Maria." Maria Reyes was the newly elected district attorney for Maricopa County, Arizona. She was elected in 2015, despite being a woman in a male-dominated field. Maria's predecessor in this position had become somewhat lenient in prosecuting criminal elements, preferring to mingle with the political elite of Phoenix, which is the administrative center of Maricopa County. This elite was unable or unwilling to help him win the election. Running on a law and order platform, Maria easily defeated her opponent by a margin of nearly 20%. The fact that she was a stereotypical Latina beauty did not hurt either. Maria Reyes was of average height, but that was where the average ended. Her long, dark, almost black hair was braided into a ponytail that cascaded down her back. Her sharp, dark brown eyes expressed intelligence and sometimes laughter. Slender as an Aztec princess, she swept through the political waters like a natural disaster. One of her campaign promises was to investigate unsolved cases and bring those responsible to justice. To this end, she hired 2 investigators who worked independently of each other. Mike Harmon, the most experienced of the 2, was the senior investigator and usually got the most difficult unsolved cases. Harmon served in the Marine Corps after graduating from high school. He spent the last 2 years of his service in the Presidential Guard in San Clemente. Mike's father was the fire chief in Tempe, Arizona, for 35 years. Inspired by his father's community service and his own experience in the Marine Corps, Mike joined the Phoenix Police Department after leaving the Marines. In just 4 years, he became a first-class detective, one of the few to achieve such success in the department's history. He became a highly skilled investigator. Sometimes his work on a case involved gathering facts, piecing together clues, and using his innate intuition, or feel, as his partners called it. After 30 years as a lead detective, the department offered him a promotion and wanted him to head the entire detective division. Mike always said, "I'm a street cop. I don't want to sit behind a desk." Maria Reyes placed a folder of documents on Mike's desk. "You did a good job on the 3 cases you closed, but this one is a little different." Mike took the folder and opened it. "How is this case different from the others?" "It's been over 25 years, 27 to be exact." "Not that it matters, but why is this case ahead of the others?" "I was going through some old files and came across this one from 1988. It was a horrible, disgusting crime." Maria took a deep breath. An elderly woman, Mrs. Helen Stoddard, was tortured, beaten, and ultimately killed for money. She was 80 years old, and the thieves apparently got less than $1,000. Maria shook her head. "Someone killed this poor old woman for money." Leafing through the folder, Mike said, "Looks like there were 2 suspects, but nothing could be proven." After reading one of the police reports, he looked at Maria. "Okay, I'll take this. I'll let you know how it goes." "Find the bastards who did this, Mike. Bring them to justice," Maria said firmly, turning and leaving the office. Mike pulled the folder toward him and carefully read all the details of the case. He planned where and when he would start his investigation, then went to lunch. His lunch was unusual. He went to the gym and spent about 45 minutes doing strength training and cardio. Mike spent the last 15 minutes of his lunch break in the shower, then ate a salad, yogurt, or some other healthy food. 3, sometimes 4 times a week, he would get up early in the morning and run 5 miles before work. Summers in Phoenix can be very hot, so he ran at dawn to spend as little time as possible in the sun. On weekends, Mike worked out even harder, while also running errands for his wife Millie and spending time with his family. Almost every Sunday, his son and daughter-in-law, his daughter and son-in-law, and his 5 grandchildren would visit him. Sometimes, when the children stayed for the weekend, the two oldest would run with him, at least part of the way, before going home. Mike participated in several 5K and 10K races and planned to run a full marathon in the fall. The result of such a healthy lifestyle was a 66-year-old man who could pass for 35 to 40, except for his hair. No amount of exercise could prevent his hair from becoming more salty than peppery, for which he was often the subject of good-natured jokes from his children. Mike's waistline was almost the same as when he joined the Phoenix Police Department. His weight, 175 pounds, was even less than then, thanks to a healthier diet and more physical activity. At 5 feet 10 inches tall, he looked like a steel block with blue eyes. Over the past 7 to 8 years as a detective in Phoenix, there had been more than one young man who thought Mike's gray hair made him look like an old curmudgeon. They misinterpreted the expression in his dark eyes, and if they acted provocatively, they would soon learn their mistake. Mike, when necessary, taught them a lesson they would not soon forget. Rumors spread throughout the house and down the street that it was best not to mess with Detective Harmon. Back in his office, Mike carefully reread the details of the report. The two suspects were Mrs. Stoddard's 25-year-old grandson and his 24-year-old brother. Her granddaughter, Judy Swanson, was 18 at the time of the murder. According to neighbors and Swanson, her boyfriend, James Duncan, and his brother William had done odd jobs and repairs at Mrs. Stoddard's house several times. Apparently, Mrs. Stoddard had hired them because of James's relationship with her granddaughter. That Friday evening, after dinner with his wife, son, and his family, Mike went into his study and began planning the investigation. Millie and Mike's son knew he was working on a case and did not press him for details. Early in his career, she had learned that he only discussed cases or the people involved in them when his investigation was yielding results. Millie also knew that when a case was difficult, especially if it was horrific or repulsive, he became very focused, if not obsessed. The only thing she asked Mike to do when he was completely absorbed in a case was to be careful. During his Saturday morning run, this time alone, Mike finally decided what to do about the Stoddard case. First, he planned to check if any of the people questioned by the first detectives were still around. After finishing his run and taking a shower, Mike took care of a few things Millie had asked him to do. The evening and Sunday were to be his last normal days until he solved the case or hit a wall. He knew the obstacle had to be very wide and very high to stop him. On Monday morning, Mike conducted research using government files, tax files, and vehicle registration files, and discovered that only 4 people were still alive or available for questioning since Stoddard's murder. They were his granddaughter, Judy Swanson, a neighbor named Brodrie, and 2 suspects, James and William Duncan. He decided that his first step would be to interview Mrs. Stoddard's only neighbor who still lived in the area, a man named Charles Brodrie. Charles Brodrie's parents owned the house east of Mrs. Stoddard's and left it, along with an acre of land, to their son. Brodrie grew up in that house and was living there in 1988. He was about 35 years old when the murders occurred, and he moved away shortly thereafter. Brodrie was living in Seligman, Arizona, when his parents died in 2010 and left him the house. Recently divorced, Charles returned to the house. He was already in his 50s. It was surprising that Mike was able to find anything in the files available to the police. "Mr. Brodrie?" Mike asked when the man opened the door. When Brodrie nodded, Mike said, "I'm Special Investigator Mike Harmon," showing his badge and ID. "I'd like to talk to you about the murder of Mrs. Stoddard. You know, the woman who lived next door." Charles Brodrie was below average height, 5 feet 4 inches. He was overweight, with thinning hair and a friendly, cheerful expression. Brodrie looked at the documents and said, "That was almost 30 years ago. Why are you asking about her now?" "I'm reviewing the case," Mike replied. "If I can, I'll find the man who killed Mrs. Stoddard and make him answer for what he did." Charles motioned to Mike, and they sat down in two Adirondack chairs on the porch. It was a beautiful spring day, sunny and warm. Later in the summer, the temperature would rise above 100 degrees for 2 or 3 months. Mike always said at that time of year that if he had a house in hell and a house in Phoenix, he would rent out the house in Phoenix and live in hell. "You won't have to look very hard to find the people who killed that poor old lady," Charles said. "Why?" "She was killed by her granddaughter's boyfriend. I think his brother was involved too." Mike knew that people sometimes talk more or remember better if they are not interrupted with questions, so he remained silent and waited for Charles Broderie to continue. "It was a little over 2 weeks after they found the old lady when these guys from Duncan came to get Grandma Judy's things." Broderie paused to see if Mike knew who he was talking about. Mike nodded, and Broderie continued. "This James guy was driving a new car, not the old clunker he usually drove." "He must have found a job and bought a car," Mike suggested. Shaking his head, Charles replied, "Neither that guy nor his brother had a job. They sometimes did odd jobs for Mrs. Stoddard around the house. Those guys didn't have a penny to their name. They couldn't have gotten the money for a new car." Charles pretended to be trying to remember something. "Now that I think about it, those guys were working for Mrs. Stoddard the day before she was found dead. I think I saw their old clunker in the driveway around 9 p.m. By 11 it was gone, and the next day Judy found her grandmother." Charles seemed to shake himself. "As you know, someone smashed the old woman's skull and killed her, and I'm willing to bet it was the Duncan boys." "Are you sure the Duncan boys' car was there?" "No, I can't be sure. I can't swear to it. Too many years have passed." Charles shook his head. "Maybe it's because I don't like those boys very much, but I still think they killed Mrs. Stoddard." Mike stood up, ready to leave. "I may want to talk to you again, Mr. Broderie, if you don't mind." "Come by any time, Mr. Harmon. I hope you catch whoever did this." Charles smiled grimly at Mike and pointed to the large oak tree in the yard. "I'll get some rope, and we can use my tree." Mike smiled back. "I'm afraid we won't be able to do that anymore." "That's too bad. Let me know how the investigation is going, Mr. Harmon." With that, Charles Broderie returned to the house. The neighboring house, owned by Mrs. Stoddard, was in a state of disrepair and was one step away from demolition. No one had lived there for 25 years. Apparently, no one wanted to buy a house where an elderly woman had been brutally murdered. Mike walked around the dilapidated building and peered inside. He studied the old house for a few minutes, then returned to his car. Back at the office, Mike called the woman's granddaughter, Judy Swanson, and arranged to meet her the next day at her work. Judy was a loan officer at a local bank. After the call, he took out the file and read it again. He reread the report from the patrol officers who were first on the scene and read the coroner's report for the first time. The elderly woman's body showed signs of multiple blows to the face. Her jaw was broken, and the bones of her left eye socket were shattered. According to the autopsy, the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the nose. The report from the detectives called to the scene stated that there were no signs of forced entry on the doors or windows, indicating that Mrs. Stoddard had let the killer into the house. That meant she knew him or them. Mike's eyes hardened as he looked at the photos taken by the medical examiner. "I'm going to catch that bastard," he vowed quietly. "And when I do—" Mike sighed and shook his head before adding, "As much as I want to do something myself, I have to let the law deal with them." The next morning at 9 a.m., Mike walked into the First National Bank of Maricopa. The young woman at the information desk directed him to Judy Swanson's office. He knocked twice and entered the office. "Miss Swanson, I'm Special Investigator Mike Harmon." "Mr. Harmon," she replied, pointing to a visitor's chair in front of her desk. "Please have a seat." Mike sat down in the chair to her left. His choice of chair seemed random, but it wasn't. Behind him was a large window through which the morning sun was shining. This put Judy in a kind of spotlight, while Mike's face remained in shadow. He had long since learned that people sometimes speak more freely when they can't see his reaction to what they're saying. As a Marine and a new detective, Mike had learned to keep a straight face so that most people couldn't read his reaction to a situation or his thoughts. Choosing where to sit was an additional way to hide his thoughts. Sitting down, Mike looked at Judy Swanson. Judy was wearing a dark, thin-striped skirt and a matching jacket, hanging on a wooden hanger on a traditional coat rack. Her blouse could have been a men's white shirt. For women, it was the answer to the suits worn by men in the business world. Her very dark hair was styled in a so-called French braid. Mike knew this because his wife wore the same hairstyle when she was at work. Judy was tall for a woman, 5 feet 10 inches, and slender, with a slightly elongated face. Mike considered her more beautiful than pretty. "You said on the phone that you wanted to talk to me about my grandmother's death, Mr. Harmon. What can I say? She was beaten to death, and the police never found the killers." Maria Reyes, Maricopa County Attorney. Mike looked at Judy and got a nod, meaning she knew who Reyes was. "She wants to reopen several unsolved cases and has assigned me to investigate your grandmother's death." Sadness clouded Judy's face, and a tear appeared in the corner of her eye. "After all these years," she whispered, and stared out the window for a few seconds. Returning to reality, Judy asked, "How can I help you, Inspector?" "I'd like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." She nodded, and Mike continued. "To the best of your knowledge, did your grandmother have any enemies?" Judy smiled. "My grandmother could be a grumpy old witch sometimes, but other than annoying some people because she always said what she thought, there was no one who hated her enough to kill her." "Was Mrs. Stoddard wealthy, and did she keep large amounts of money in the house?" "I think she lived more than comfortably for the time. Her house was paid for, she didn't need a car, she didn't go to restaurants, and she didn't eat anything fancy at home." Judy smiled again. "Grandma didn't trust banks very much, so she kept her money at home. I don't know if it was a lot. It depended on when she got her pension and benefits, but she could have had anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000. When the amount got too big, I always argued with her and tried to convince her to put the money in a savings account." The smile disappeared from Judy's face. "Grandma always told me that the money would be mine when she died." "I'm very sorry, Miss Swanson. I understand that this must be difficult for you." Mike paused for a few seconds and said in a very quiet voice, "The report says that you found your grandmother the day after she, killed." "You can say the word, Mr. Harmon," Judy said. "I've had many years to get used to the fact that my grandmother was killed." "It's a terrible word, and an even more terrible act, Miss Swanson." Mike paused and said, "I've read your statement. Is there anything you'd like to add to what you told the detectives?" Judy looked at him, started to say something, but stopped. She shook her head. "Miss Swanson, sometimes people remember things over time. A couple of months after an event, they may remember something or realize that they gave incomplete or inaccurate statements. Depending on how involved they were in the event, they may be embarrassed to admit that they were wrong, and they may only come forward later." "You're right, Inspector, there are a couple of things I didn't tell the detectives." She hesitated. "A couple of weeks after I found Grandma, I noticed that James and William had a lot more money." "You mean James and William Duncan?" "Yes. As you probably know, James and I were dating at the time." Mike nodded, and Judy continued. "As I said, the boys had a lot of money. James took me to places he couldn't afford before. Our dates used to be inexpensive, and I often paid for them. I asked him about it several times, but he just smiled and said that a distant relative had left him the money. James changed after he got the money. He became more pushy and controlling." "Anything else?" Mike asked. "One more thing I didn't tell the police." Judy paused. "You have to understand, I was drinking a lot and was in shock over losing my grandmother. She was the only person I had left." She buried her head in her chest for a few seconds, then continued. My grandmother kept money in the house, not just for everyday expenses, but a large nest egg in a hiding place. It was savings from a small amount she had set aside for unexpected expenses. I found out about it about a month before she died. When the police cleared the crime scene, as they called it, I looked around the house. Her usual hiding place was empty. There was usually about $1,000 there. In another hiding place, there was sometimes up to $40,000. Judy smiled slightly. That was money I had convinced her to put in a savings account. Grandma didn't trust banks very much, you know. I didn't discover that the special hiding place was empty until 2 weeks after she died. Mike knew that wasn't all, so he waited. As I said, he started spending the money. Expensive restaurants, clothes, jewelry, and a new car. I think James and William stole my grandmother's money. They may have killed her. I should have told the police about this. That's the real reason I broke up with him. Mike saw tears in Judy's eyes and gave her a minute to calm down. Thank you, Miss Swanson. He stood up to leave. Detective, if you catch or find out who did this to my grandmother, will you let me know? Please. You can count on me, Miss Swanson, Mike replied and left her office. Returning to his desk, Mike decided it was time to examine the box of evidence in the case. He went to the evidence room, which was a large room with metal shelves, and asked for the box labeled Stoddard, H, number August 22, 1988, code 561.02. The case number indicated the name of the victim, the date of the crime, and the criminal code for second-degree murder. In addition, the perpetrators, if found, would be charged with numerous other crimes, such as robbery, burglary, grand larceny, and a number of other serious offenses. If evidence of intent and malice was found, they could be charged with first-degree murder. After reviewing the likely and possible charges, Mike said, "We have enough to execute these bastards if we catch them." Mike placed the box on the table and signed the form attached to it. It stated that he had maintained the chain of custody and that the contents of the box had not left his sight. The box contained reports from the first patrol officer to arrive at the scene, the medical examiner, and the detectives who worked on the case. There were several signed and sealed bags of evidence. Mike knew from his research on the people who were still alive in 1988 that there was no need to rework the entire case. After carefully studying the reports of Detectives Welker and King, Mike concluded that the detectives who investigated the case had done everything they could. His task was to look at things from a new perspective and, if possible, find a new or different approach to the investigation and the evidence. One bag of evidence contained several Winston cigarette butts, another contained a nearly smoked-out pen, a third contained the wrapper from some kind of cheese product, and the last contained a pair of leather gloves with blood on the knuckles. Mike took out his cell phone and called Judy Swanson. "Hello, Inspector," she answered. "Miss Swanson, did James or William smoke? If so, do you remember what kind of cigarettes they smoked?" "Yes. James smoked Winston, and William usually asked him for cigarettes." "Are you sure about the brand after all these years?" "Yes, I'm sure. James always asked me to buy him cigarettes when they ran out. Once I bought him a different brand, he got very angry, and I thought he was going to hit me." "Thank you, Miss Swanson. I'll be in touch." Before returning the box of evidence, Mike reread the informal notes of Detectives Welker and King, who had investigated the murder. Usually, notebooks weren't put in the box, but sometimes, if a case remained unsolved, a detective would leave his notes in the evidence box so they wouldn't get lost if he needed to refer to them in the future. Police reports had to be factual and describe the investigation without embellishment or personal opinions. Notebooks usually reflected the detective's thoughts, ideas, feelings, and assumptions. These notes provided a more complete picture of how the detective felt about the case than the official report. Mike read Detective Welker's notes. "We interviewed James and William Duncan at their home. During the interview, James repeatedly told William to be quiet. Both men were nervous. Their answers were evasive and sometimes changed during the interview. Detective King's notes on the interview were similar. In the last sentence, he expressed his opinion. "I am confident that these two men robbed and killed the victim." Judging by the records, both detectives considered James and William Duncan to be the prime suspects, but they did not have enough evidence to charge them or even arrest them. Looking at the evidence bag containing a dozen Winston cigarette butts, Mike smiled. He knew from experience that items in evidence bags, police reports, and even detectives' notes didn't look like they did on TV. In real life, solving a crime took much longer than it did on TV shows. All the information and evidence were the result of hours, days, and sometimes weeks of investigation. Collecting evidence, autopsy reports, police reports, interviewing neighbors, and thoroughly examining the crime scene all required days of work, research, and man-hours. Mike repackaged the evidence bag, signed it, returned it to the officer in charge of the locker, and left. Mike spent the rest of the day studying the Stoddard case again. He reread the medical examiner's report on the old woman's injuries and the cause of her death. The severity of her injuries made him feel nauseous and vomit. Mike felt anger bordering on rage toward anyone who could beat an old, defenseless woman like that. 3 hours later, he closed the case, took off his glasses, and massaged his nose. "Tomorrow I'll talk to James and William to get a better understanding of them," he said quietly to himself. Mike's voice was soft and quiet, but his gaze contradicted his words. Mike knew where James worked and lived. William didn't work, but lived with his brother. He planned to arrive at the Duncan house around the time James was due to return from work. Duncan worked as a night cleaner and handyman at the city's power distribution center. When he arrived, Mike parked on the street in front of the house the Duncans rented. The neighborhood was on the outskirts of a busy area where houses and shops had been renovated. The house looked shabby compared to them and was on the verge of demolition. One more crooked board or sagging porch, and it would have been condemned. The battered pickup truck parked at the entrance was in no better condition than the house. One bumper had been replaced with a less dented one, but it was a different color. The side panels were rusted, with several holes, and the paint had oxidized to a pale blue color. When Mike knocked, James Duncan opened the door. He was about 25 when Mrs. Stoddard was killed. Now James was 52, and the years had not been kind to him. He was thin and looked like a drug addict. James held the door open, and Mike noticed needle marks on his arm where his shirt sleeve had slipped down. "Yes?" James asked. "Mr. Duncan, I'm Special Investigator Harmon," Mike said, holding out his badge and ID. "Can we talk to you?" It was early spring in Phoenix, and the temperature was mild, so Mike was wearing a sports jacket. When he took out his badge, the jacket slipped down, revealing a .45 caliber Glock 21 pistol in a holster on his right hip. James glanced at the gun. "Are you a cop?" "I'm a special investigator with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Can we talk?" "About what? I haven't done anything." "I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Duncan. I want to talk to you about the robbery and murder of Helen Stoddard." Duncan paled and took a step back. "I don't know anything about that. Besides, it was 30 years ago. 27 years ago, to be exact, Mr. Duncan. I just wanted to review the statements you and your brother gave to the police. Do you mind? Is William here?" "I think so." Hearing Mike's conversation with James, William approached and stood behind his brother. He leaned forward and whispered, "Be careful, James." "Shut up, Willie," James ordered. Turning to Mike, he said, "Go ahead, but as I said, I don't know anything." "About 80-year-old Mrs. Stoddard being horribly tortured?" Mike asked. "What? Someone beat an old woman half to death, killed her, and stole her money." Mike didn't wait for the Duncans to answer. "Your statement says that on the night of the murder, you were together at the movies. Is that true?" James nodded, and a moment later William nodded as well. "What movie?" "What?" "What movie did you watch?" You didn't say that in your statement. I don't remember. I told you it was 30 years ago. Mike pretended to look at his notebook. You and William did various jobs and errands for Mrs. Stoddard? Were you working for her on the day she was murdered? I already told you it was 30 years ago. I don't remember. James was clearly nervous and confused. Shortly after the robbery and murder, you bought a new car. It was more of a statement than a question. Mike knew that if you pressed the person you were questioning, they often said more than they wanted to reveal. Yes, I was saving up and a guy at work was getting divorced. He didn't want his wife to get his car, so he offered me a good deal and I bought it. James looked at Mike to see his reaction. What was the guy's name? How much did you pay for it? John something, I don't remember. It was... I know, Mike interrupted him. It was 30 years ago. It's just weird that you remember the details so well but don't remember the guy's name. Mike looked at James for a few seconds. How long have you been doing this? He asked, pointing to James's hands. I don't do this. I've been clean for almost a year. Mike didn't believe the lie. Many of the marks were fresh. Okay, Mr. Duncan, thank you for your time. Mike turned and walked to his car. Mike felt the same way the detectives who had worked on the case in 1988 had felt. He was convinced the Duncans were guilty. James had acted normal until Mike asked him about his relationship with Mrs. Stoddard. Then he had become nervous and started sweating. Back at the office, Mike called Maria Reyes. After saying hello, Mike asked, On the Stoddard case, can we have the contents of the evidence bag's DNA tested? As you know, we didn't have any DNA back then, but modern techniques might help us solve the case. She agreed to order the test and said she would do it urgently. Do you have a suspect, Mike? Maria asked, her voice tinged with emotion. Yes, I do. I believe the detectives who worked on the original case were on the right track. They thought they knew who robbed and killed the old woman. He paused for a few seconds. Well, are you going to tell me, or do I need to get a search warrant? Maria joked. I think the Duncan brothers, James and William, committed the crime. I say both, because William doesn't go to the bathroom without James's permission. Do you have any evidence? Nothing substantial, just circumstantial facts, but I have a hunch. What facts? Maria asked. Well, James and William worked for Mrs. Stoddard from time to time. According to the Duncan brothers, they were working for her on the day of the murder. According to the granddaughter, the old lady went to one of her secret places and took out their wages so they knew where the money was kept. Maria wanted to tease Mike for using the word therefore, but the seriousness of the conversation stopped her. James bought an expensive new car shortly after the robbery, Mike continued. He said he had saved up the money, but he never had a steady job, and Mrs. Stoddard didn't pay him very much. The cigarette butts found at the crime scene belonged to Winston. James smoked that brand 30 years ago. Mike paused again, then added, If we can get DNA from the evidence found at the crime scene, we can open a case and arrest them. We can't force James and William to give DNA samples based on suspicion, Maria objected. As you know, if a suspect is arrested for a serious crime, the court requires a DNA sample. You're right. That law was passed in 2008 by the Arizona legislature as Bill 377, Maria informed Mike. All I know is that James and William were arrested, charged, and convicted of breaking into a gas station in 2010. That's a second-degree felony. They had to submit DNA samples when they were arrested. That means they're in the system. Maria's voice sounded excited. We may get the DNA results soon. Russ Devo is the head of the lab, and he owes me a couple of favors. He said if he rushes it, he can get the results in a few days instead of a few weeks. So you'll have the results very soon. Maybe as early as Thursday, and I'll send them to you as soon as they're ready. On Thursday morning at 10:15, a courier from the crime lab delivered the DNA analysis report to Detective Harmon. Mike didn't understand the graphs and numbers in the report, but he read and understood the forensic scientist's summary. The DNA found on the evidence, cigarette butts, a chewed-up pen, bloody gloves, and a cheese wrapper, matched that of James and William Duncan. "I see," Mike said tensely. Then he picked up the phone. "Hello, Prosecutor Reyes. This is Special Investigator Mike Harmon." He smiled slightly, then became serious. "We got them, Maria. We got those bastards." "So the DNA matches," she replied. "Yes, the test confirmed that it's James and William Duncan's DNA. I'm arresting them today. I'll let you know when they're in custody." He hung up and called again to summon 2 police officers to accompany him before he left the house. William Duncan opened the door. Seeing Mike and 2 uniformed police officers, he immediately became nervous. "William Duncan, you are under arrest for the robbery and murder of Mrs. Helen Stoddard," Mike said. He grabbed William by the arm to prevent him from escaping. "Handcuff him," Mike ordered the patrolman. "You have the right to remain silent," Mike continued, reading the suspect's rights from a plastic card. Having worked in the police force for many years, he knew these rights by heart, but he wanted to make sure the suspects couldn't exploit any loopholes. "Given those rights, do you want to talk to me?" Mike finished and stared at William. "You won't prove anything," William boasted. "The cops couldn't frame us 30 years ago, and you won't be able to now." William straightened up and looked defiantly at Mike. "We have your DNA on the cigarettes you smoked with James and on the pen you chewed on," Mike replied. Mike smiled at William the way a very hungry shark smiles. "You and your brother will stand trial. There's no doubt about that." William slumped a little. "Where's James?" "He's at the factory working the day shift this week." William hesitated. "I didn't kill that old woman. James did. I'm willing to confirm that," he offered. "It doesn't matter. You're an accomplice at the very least. You're just as guilty as James." Mike gave him a calculating look. "Of course, if you turn in your brother, it could save you from a first-degree murder charge. You could avoid the death penalty for first-degree murder." "Okay, I'll tell you everything." "Don't say anything now. When we get to the jail, we'll talk about everything." Turning to the patrolman, he said, "Put him in the car, take him back, and lock him up." Then, pointing to another cop, Mike said, "Come with me. We'll take my car and go after the other idiot." Duncan was taking pieces of pipe out of the trailer when Mike and the police officer approached him. "James Duncan, you are under arrest for the robbery and murder of Mrs. Helen Stoddard." James was holding a 6-foot piece of metal pipe and looked like he was about to fight. "Oh, please, let's do this another way," Mike said, almost pleading, putting his hand on the handle of his Glock. "Please, let's do this another way," he repeated. Duncan dropped the pipe. Mike signaled to the patrolman, and they handcuffed James. "You have the right to remain silent," Mike read, then recited James's Miranda rights. "You'll never be able to prove it," James said. "Like I told your stupid brother, who, by the way, is going to turn you in, we have your DNA from the crime scene. We're going to prove it, and I'm going to watch you go to jail." "You had to bring backup to arrest me, didn't you?" James boasted. "Not exactly. I brought them for your safety," Mike replied. James looked puzzled, and Mike continued. "I was going to come alone and hope you did something like you were going to do with the pipe. But then I thought that if I shot you, you wouldn't suffer enough." "Good morning, Inspector Harmon." Maria Reyes entered Mike's office with a broad smile on her face. "Good morning, District Attorney Reyes." They smiled at each other, and Mike asked, "How can I help you this morning?" "I just wanted to let you know that the grand jury has returned an indictment against the Duncans. I'm going to seek a second-degree murder charge. We can't prove intent, but we can charge them with murder while committing a felony. When we get the conviction, William will get 25 years to life without parole, even with his confession, and if he lives to be released, he'll be almost 80. James will get life, and I hope he suffers every day." Maria walked over to Mike, patted him on the shoulder, and shook his hand. "Good job, Mike. I just continued the good work of Detectives Welker and King. The DNA made the real difference. Mike stared out the window for a few seconds. I'm glad we caught them. Maybe now Mrs. Stoddard can find some peace. You deserve a vacation, Mike, Maria suggested. What do you want to do? Before he answered, a small, humorless smile flitted across his face. The next case, lawyer, give me the next case.